Section 6 of Irish Idylls by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 6. Terence, unhappily for himself, could run on no errand, and he had sat for a very long time on the dyke near his door, perforce overhearing the neighbours determine what his mother had died of, when Peg Sheridan limped up to him with a poor scrap of comfort. Peg has, as it may be remembered, a serious trouble of her own, which makes her neighbours' affairs rather insipid to her under ordinary circumstances, so that she is not generally popular, since sensitive people will condone many deliberate sins more easily than the unintentional affront of a simple, friendly indifference. But they allow that if anything off the common ails them, there is no one readier than Peg to do them any good turn she can. The presence of a great grief, in fact, filling her with sympathy as a forgotten rock pool is filled when a wave from the wide sea flaps over its brim. She came towards Terence more jerkily than usual, for the frequent flashes scared her as much as anybody, and complicated her chronic hobble with queer swerves and startings aside, and she said, "Terence, I don't believe she's that bad. I saw her somethin' the same way one day last harvest, when she had Stacey like one deminted, but never a die on her that time, or maybe this either, if she could get Dan O'Beirne to her soon enough." "Peg," said Terence, looking up into her face, where freckles and sunburn had not found much beauty to spoil, "you're the jewel of the world, so you are to be saying it, but she's gone, and she was axin' me to stay wid her." That day's storm raged long and ranged widely. It met a detachment of the Lisconnel congregation on their way back from Mass, and so daunted them that they took shelter under the wall of Dan O'Beirne's forge. They could not get inside because the place was all shut up, and he had gone somewhere, probably on shebeening business. Stacey Doyne was among them, somewhat out of spirits. Her expedition had been on the whole a disappointment. It is true that she had attended Mass, which was what she thought had been her object, and yet, however, it certainly was no affair of hers, nor did she care a thraneen who spoke to the Farrelly girls as they went into the porch, or who was not there to give her good morning when she came out. She said, besides, that she looked a queer ugly old show in her patched petticoat and torn shawl, and considered that she would probably stay at home next Sunday. As the rain long continued to come down in gleaming sheets, which the other women would call the clearing shower, and just wait a bit to see the end of it, she grew uneasy about her mother, who she knew would be fretting herself into fiddle strings, and perhaps would run out in the wet to fill the pot and get her death of cold on them, unless she was too badly frighted of the thunder. But they were starting at last, when a Duffclane lad ran against them as they came round the angle of a forge wall. "Is himself in it?" he shouted. "Och no, I was certain sure he wasn't. He's wanted up above. I met young Mick Ryan legging it over the bog about Shanasheen to look for him. And Stacey Doyne's wid you. Och, Stacey, it's bad news I'm bringing you. Och, your poor mother's destroyed, girl alive, burnt black, in the fire not at all, with the awful lightnin', struck down at her door, and burnt to a cinder in an instant. One of the young chaps was struck too, blinded, but there's life in him yet, and I'm goin' to try can I get Father Rooney to him. I must be steppin'." Stacey thought at first that when she had run all those miles home without stopping, and had found her mother sitting in the corner by the hearth, saying, "Child of grace, what's kept you till this time?" she would stay there content all the rest of her life, and never again put herself in the way of hearing people bawl such things at her. But by the time she had run herself out of breath, she had run into the heart of a blank despair. She walked slower then, and slower, amid the unmeaning murmur of the eager voices, and splashing rain and distant thunder. And towards the end of their journey she lagged so that the other girls pulled her along between them. When they were coming in sight of their knockawn, somebody exclaimed, "Why, look you, isn't that Dan O'Beirne himself, and young Dan on the top of the hill?" And with that they all made a rush for the latest news. Stacey slipped behind and sat down under a trickling lichened boulder, with her hands over her eyes and ears to crush out sights and sounds. She sat down in a condemned cell of misery, and she rose to her feet, if one must not say in the courts of paradise, at any rate somewhere in its purlieus, because young Dan, who had pulled away her hands from her face, was still holding her wrist and cheerfully saying, "Sure she's doin' fine now, Stacey dear. You've no need to be distressin' yourself about her. She wasn't too bad at all. 'Twas just a weakness she took, and me father gave her some of his stuff done her a powerful good, Stacey jewel." The very skies had cleared swiftly, and sent a sheaf of long westering rays to kindle the rainbow fire in a myriad shimmering drops. "Aye," corroborated the elder Dan, "she'll be as lively as a grig to morrow, plase God. Terence'll be longer laid up wid the bit of a wrench he's after givin' his ankle." "Thank you kindly, Dan. Sure they had me annoyed," was all Stacey said. "Where'd the world of us be only for Dan?" said the widow M'Gurk. "Dan O'Beirne, the blacksmith and shebener, is so well liked by his neighbours that they all are perfectly certain that his grandfather, also a blacksmith, used to forge pike heads in the troubles of '98. His own peculiar source of pride is that his family belongs to the O'Beirnes of Wicklow, who, as everybody knows, have been notorious rebels time out of mind. But that his popularity does not rest upon these historical bases will be clear to any of us who are aware how many miles he will tramp unfeed to visit some one took sick, with whom, if bad enough, he thinks it a small matter to sit up all night. His broad, benevolent forehead has glimmered like a lamp of hope between mud floor and thatch roof through many a dark hour. And if, as not seldom happens, all the light flickers out when the day is dawning, everybody knows that Dan left something undone that lay within the compass of his kindliness and skill. Bedad, if Dan O'Beirne couldn't keep the breath in her body, the devil himself couldn't, not if one was her soul and the other was purgatory, Pat Ryan said on an occasion of this sort, using a figure of speech which perhaps had more appositeness than he suspected. Dan's merits, scientific and moral, are indeed highly rated, not only absolutely but relatively, as contrasted with those of Dr. Ward at the dispensary down beyant, whose services Lisconnel seeks rarely, and generally in vain, his district being a world too wide for any licensed practitioner to administer single-handed, however swift his rattletrap car, and however brief his visits. When he proves thus unattainable, people remark, "Ah well, I question could he ha' done a hap'orth of good. He is a well-meanin' poor man, they say, and mightn't make such a bad offer at it, if he wasn't always in a hurry, and would take time to what he was about. But it stands to reason that he can't know rightly what he's doin' when he won't so much as be at the trouble of attending to half the particulars his patient give him about their symptoms, and interrupts them in the middle as if he could possibly find out how they were feeling without being told. As for his medicines, they have no strength in them at all. Lisconnel utterly despises any physic that is in the least endurable either in taste or odour. Or if he does send an odd bottle that smells as if it might have some good in it, he calls it a liniment, and is careful to stick on it a yellow poison label, for fear you should try a drop. On the other hand, there is plenty of strength in his language if by chance he attends a summons and finds the invalid in a normal state of health. His frame of mind when such a contretemps takes place is afterwards variously described as raging mad, as cross as the dogs, fit to be tied, on his hind legs begob, and so forth, as if, Brian Kilfoyle remarked, he'd liefer have found the unlucky bosthoon lying on the broad of his back, waiting death. Or as if it weren't as simple and easy as anything else to say, the devil take yous, and roll off home again wid no trouble prescribing or aught. "And be paid for it too, mind you, handsome," appended a neighbour. This is in striking contrast to Dan O'Byrne, who, when called in by mistake, will say quite pleasant, "Sure I'm never be wishful to see you worser anyways," or declare it would take an M.D. with more letters than he had in his name to perceive much amiss, which gives an agreeably humorous complexion to affairs. And Dan's medicines are undeniably strong. A certain cordial of his own compounding enjoys a very wide local reputation, and has brought round dozens and scores of people. If questioned about its ingredients, he will but grin blandly and say something of the nature of "Och, now, that'd be tellin'." However, anybody can tell that it smells aromatically of herbs. My own opinion is that the rest of it consists mainly of faith and poteen, though in what proportions they are combined I am not chemist enough to discover. At all events, there can be no doubt that on this thundery Sunday afternoon a sup of it out of her thick pink and white delft cup, with embossed coral sprays on the sides, materially helped to restore poor Mrs. Doyne, who began to feebly struggle back from her long swoon or trance, just as Dan and his son, by some neatly joined pieces of good luck, arrived at her door. So rapidly did she revive that he was soon able to pronounce her illigant and grand, and to diagnose her case as just some quare turn the ugly weather'd been after giving her, but glory be to goodness, she'd find herself completely the better of it by tomorrow or next day. Outside her door, however, he said with emphasis, "Aye, she'll do rightly, but she's weak these times, the poor woman, feeble, I might say, and if she's tormented with anything, or gave frights to, or botherationed wid folks risin' argufyments about blathers and nonsense, there's no sayin' but she might be slippin' away wid herself suddint on yous one of these fine days. She just might, and so I tell you plainly, which makes me think that Mrs. Kilfoyle may have dropped him a hint." Then, when Dan had prescribed a stup of marshmallows for Terence's sprain, his professional duties were discharged, and he was at liberty to indulge himself and his neighbours with more lively conversation. It really seemed as if the electrical condition of the atmosphere must have given a fillip to the march of events in and around Lisconnel, so much more than usual happened thereabouts on that day. "Who do you think are after making a match of it?" Dan said towards the end of his budget of news. "It was only settled this morning, the young chap was telling me, and we coming along. Why, Maggie Farrelly no less, and a farmer's son from off one of enmeshes, a young man of the name of, and a dacint lad, I'm told. If they're the people I'm supposin', they own cows. Maybe he's got no great prize wid her, not but what she's well lookin' enough. I'd not go for to sayin' anything too bad agin the girl, but in my opinion she's a bit of a rogue, over fond of keepin' the lads fandanglin' after her to be makin' fools of them, accordin' as she may fancy. Och, very belike she might settle down now that she's sorted out one for herself, on'y I'd lief as not she's no dalins wid any belongin's of mine. Do you know, a while ago I had a notion she was thinkin', where's Dan got to? Sure, is that him above there lookin' out over the road? I'd a notion she was thinkin' of gettin' round him, for I noticed him goin' about wid her followin' a couple of times or so. But he swears be this and be that there was ne'er a talk of any such a thing on his part. 'Twas a friend of his was about courtin' her, and axed him to keep around and be slippin' in a word now and again might give her mind a sort of slant to begin wid, that was foolish enough too, in all conscience, to be for slinkin' in on another lad's tongue, instead of speaking up and bidding the girl to take him or leave him on his own recommendations. Anyway, the end of the matter is that she's sacked her old sweethearts, every man jack of them, and took up with this one she hadn't set eyes on, they say, a couple of weeks since." "Musha then, old Horny himself might take Mag Farrelly and welcome, for me," said Terence Doyne, who was so exhilarated by the reaction of his escape from despair to security that it was all his lamed foot could do to keep him from dancing. "Oh, for me," said his brother Matt, who also felt at peace with the world, and the whole lot of them into the bargain. "They're mostly more bother than they're worth, a dale. I'll go and be gettin' some of the mallow for his foot, and Stacey can give it a boil when she comes home. She'll be here directly." "Within Maggie Farrelly, indeed," said Judy Ryan, who had, as she said herself, no opinion, by which she meant a bad one, of the bride-elect. "Cock her up wid a fine young man like your son, Dan. He's got more wit than to look the side of road she is, I'll go bail. There's not one of those Farrellys I'd give the black of me eye for. A slutherin', deceptionable set." Soon after that the elder Dan joined his son upon the hill, and they fared homewards, presently falling in, as we have seen, with a party of friends. It would indeed have been rather inhuman to keep Stacey Doyne so long upon the road as I have done, were it not that she was all the while in Paradise, where people overlook such trivialities as being wet through and tired out with a many miles tramp, and having had nothing to eat for nearly a round of the clock. "And how at all did you hear tell of it, Dan?" inquired Mrs. M'Gurk, "when nobody had an idea where to be looking for you, and one's liker to lose oneself than to find any one else round on the bog if one goes chancing it?" "'Twas the young chap," said Dan, pointing to his son. "He met wid a couple of spalpeens, inquirin' for me not far from our place, so he legged it after me there, but I'd quit out of there before he came, and then he followed me to Brosnakill, where he got me. So he's had great runnin' over the country this day, the young rapscallion." "Troth," said young Dan, "I'd run twyst that far for Stacey Doyne any day of the year, or for any one belongin' to her, and she knows it." No declaration could, according to Lisconnel canons, have been more explicitly worded. It startled them all severely, young Dan himself not excepted. If Stacey had shown herself by any means equal to the occasion, she would at least have responded. "Know it," says he, "bedad, and indeed it's himself has the wonderful notions about what I may happen to know. Sure he's just talkin' foolish." But she was taken somewhat at a disadvantage, and in fact said nothing at all. "Tearin' ages," said Dan's father, "and is that the way of the wind with you? Well, to be sure, but there's no bein' up to the likes of you. Begorra, I might ha' known he'd somethin' in his head when he was runnin' me off of me misfort'nit ould legs all the way over from yonder to here this mornin'. I'd as lief ha' been in leadin' strings to an unruly bullock. Not that I'm denyin' he might aisy ha' took up wid some one worser. There's no dacenter people on this country side than the Doynes and little Stacey. Howanever, Mrs. M'Gurk, we that have the wit are to be pitied now, aren't we, with them young gomerals, the crathurs?" Old Dan's chagrin was about half earnest, his inordinate pride in his handsome son compelling him to think but poorly of anybody considered as a possible daughter-in-law, while his general philanthropy disposed him to make the best of everybody that came in his way, none the less when appearing in the shape of a pretty, pleasant-spoken slip of a colleen, with whom he had been acquainted ever since she was big enough to crawl out of her door at him as he passed. The result of these conflicting tendencies here was a vacillation between censoriousness and indulgence, which made it difficult for him to preserve a consistent demeanour. "I'll tell you one thing, and that's not two," he said, with a sudden access of resolution caused by a glance around him. "We'd better all of us be steppin' home if we had enough of drowndin' to satisfy us for this day. The sky's cloudin' over agin, like as if the storm might be plannin' to give us another bout." "Begob now, Dan, there's no call for you to be seein' Stacey over the hill. The child's in a hurry to run home to her mother, and you'd just delay her. Forby don't I know as well as if I was inside you that you'll be takin' off wid yourself over here the first thing to morra. For where's the sense of biding for a wettin' to night? There's a sun dog over yonder agin that black cloud, and look at them cratures crawlin', you may say, on their wings. There's nary a sure sign of rain. The swallows, praying towards storms, were indeed flying very low, sweeping in such immense circles that their return seemed as problematical as the reappearance of a periodic comet. Darkly piled up cloud masses still hovered and drifted, spreading deep purple shadows over the bog, gloom folded on gloom, ready to league with the gathering twilight. But just as Stacey returned to run home, the sun, now dropped very far down in the west, found a little round hole in a grim black wall, and through it flashed up obliquely a jet of golden amber fire, broadening fanwise sheer across the sky. It set all the raindrops twinkling where every leaf and blade had its drop, and it glistened and shimmered in many a brimming pool. Speeding down the hill, Stacey felt as if she were flying into an enchanted, dazzling sort of world on new and wonderful wings. A neighbour of hers, however, who was sedately going the same way, observed, "It looks bad for the weather when the sun makes a chimney like yon. We'll be apt to have a wet night." And another replied, "I doubt we're not done with the thunder yet." Chapter 8. Between two Lady Days. The Lady Day in harvest, which fell 6 weeks or so after the electrical July Sunday, was splendidly fine in Lisconnel, steeped through and through with ripe August sunshine, and unruffled by any restless breeze. Its serene beauty jarred upon Stacey Doyne's mood, and though she did not guess, helped to make the lag-foot hours halt by more slowly and heavily. But she was keenlier alive to a sense of aggravating circumstances when at an early period of the morning it became evident that Mad Bell, seized by one of her irresistible lyrical frenzies, had been driven to establish herself on a sun-smitten bank near her door, whence her shrill singing resounded far and wide. What she sang loudest and longest was a favourite ditty, beginning: "Before I was married I used to drink tay, but since I am married 'tis buttermilk whey. Before I was married I sat in the parlour, but since I am married 'tis the ash corner." A wish to escape beyond the range of that oft-repeated air led Stacey to ramble away further than she otherwise would have done over the heathery crests of the Knockawn, where the sombre ruddy bloom against the black peat mould suggested the smouldering and charring of half-extinguished embers, until at last she sat down on a boulder between two sheltering clumps of broom and furze, which made her a low-roofed bower. Here Mad Bell was too far off for the tune or words. Only a faint skirl came fitfully borne upon a flagging breeze, scarcely a trace, as chemists say, upon the surrounding atmosphere of stillness. Nothing else broke it either with motion or sound, except when, even and anon, a flight of little wild birds got up suddenly in the distance like a handful of dust tossed into the air, and when a curlew cried plaintively across the bog, a cunning tone-poet, who can set a whole landscape to melancholy in one quick chromatic phrase. Stacey wanted indeed no external incitements to sadness, having at present ample grounds for it in her own situation and reflections. This radiant summer morning, with its arc of moteless sapphire and high tides of unstinted shining, should have ushered in her wedding day. It had all been arranged weeks ago, ages ago it did seem to her now, for the elder Dan's dissatisfaction with his son's choice had melted away rapidly and completely. In point of fact, on that very eventful Sunday evening when the matter first came to light, the two O'Beirnes had on their homeward way met the cross priest posting up to Lisconnel in obedience to a tragical summons, and in the course of the explanations which ensued, the good-natured blacksmith betrayed himself into tacitly withdrawing any meditated opposition to the match. "So, your riverence, there's little signs of a buryin' over this business at all," said he, "but I wouldn't say as much concernin' a weddin'." "Troth, no, I'd not. For to tell your riverence the truth, it's my belief that young Gomerel there has a notion, himself and little Stacey Doyne, to be troublin' you or Father Rooney, long life to him, one of these days." "Och, begorra, that's the worth of the likes of them." Dan privately thought that the three kingdoms would have been put to produce the likes of his son. What better need you expect? Father Carroll was humane enough to hear with relief that, after all, none of his parishioners had been burned alive or blinded, and he naturally rejoiced at the abridgment of his long, late ride. So he received the news more genially than usual, and as he turned his horse's willing head, he shook his whip handle jocularly at young Dan, saying: "Indeed now, O'Beirne, I wouldn't put it past them, the pair of them. But if you're for settin' up a wife, Dan, you'll have to be steady and stick to your work and mind what you're about. Clap on your blinkers, me lad, and keep the road straight before you, or you'll land more than yourself in the ditch." Dan, who looked very unwontedly sheepish, kicked the lump of turf in front of him further than his own shadow, which stretched a long way distortedly through the beams of the rising moon, as he answered: "Och, sure me father wouldn't get his health if he didn't be talkin', so he wouldn't. Be the hokey, it's a wonderful man he is for romancin' entirely." After this, the current of the young couple's affairs, so far as they stood upon the choice of friends, was practically unimpeded, and their wooing undoubtedly deserved the benison pronounced on those which are conducted with dispatch. But the edict of destiny fulfils itself in many ways. At the same time when young Dan entered into his engagement with Stacey Doyne, he had a prior one on hand, which his new tie did not dispose, or rather forbade, him to break. This was a journey all the way up to the County Antrim, where a friend of his held out prospects for a 4 weeks' job at a compressed peat manufactory, the manager of which found labour scarce in those harvesting days. Now young Dan O'Beirne, being not only strong and stalwart, but endowed with an intuitive gift of understanding the queerness of all sorts of machinery, Thomas Macrum, the northerner, who had himself got the promise of work up there, made no manner of doubt that so desirable a hand would find at all events temporary employment, and a scale of remuneration which sounded prodigious in the ears of Lisconnel. Dan's contemplated marriage rendered the acquisition of a little ready money in a high degree expedient, if not absolutely necessary, for his father's philanthropy was of a humble personal kind, never known to enrich or in any way aggrandize the family in which it runs, and the O'Beirnes, despite forge and shebeen, were hardly better off than their struggling neighbours. Given a pound or two in hand for the purchase of a few odd sticks of things and the rent of a cabin down below, Dan and Stacey could start housekeeping with light hearts. Failing that, the match would be held imprudent even by people who entertained the most moderate views about marriage settlements. So Dan went off one morning, confident of returning with at least that sum a clear fortnight before Lady Day, which had been fixed for the wedding. Stacey had plenty to distract her mind during his absence. There was the trousseau, for one thing. Her mother sold their pig prematurely, at somewhat of a sacrifice, that she might be able to buy a sufficiency of hideous, strong brown wincey for a body and a skirt. These two articles of clothing are seldom simultaneously acquired in Lisconnel, and when, in the course of the negotiations at his shop in the town, Mr. Corr learned the purpose for which the stuff was required, he added gratis some yards of the stoutest grey holland in his stock, to make Stacey a couple of large aprons, praskeens she called them, whereupon Lisconnel opined that Mr. Corr always was a kind-hearted poor man. Then the wedding itself furnished a theme for endless planning and discussion, especially when Farmer Hilferthy down below actually promised the loan of his jaunting car to meet the bridal party at Clayson's Boreen, half-way to the chapel. Stacey had never in her life been on a car or any other vehicle, and the prospect of the drive evidently heightened more than one would have imagined her sense of the solemnity and importance of the whole ceremony. Thus the days bustled on blithely enough, burnished up for her by the gleams of a happy hour, which she knew came stealing towards her. Yet when it arrived, it proved to be the turning point whence all her fortunes began to wane through a twilight of doubt and despondency to an ever-deepening despair. Dan did not reappear on the day when he was expected. Stacey, in her ignorance, felt not a little aggrieved at the delay, although she was quite sure that the next morning would bring him. 12 hours seem a vast void of time when you have already begun to count your intervening minutes one by one. But after 2 or 3 more days had trailed immeasurably by, she would have been humbly thankful for an assurance that she would see him again within a 12-month. So quickly may we learn to abate our claims upon good fortune. It wanted just a week of the wedding day when a man casually observed to Stacey's brother Matt, as they were hooding stooks below at Hilferthy's, that he had seen Dan O'Beirne going on board the Stranraer steamer up at Larne, shortly before he had himself returned to Lisconnel. The poor little bride-elect put a brave face on the matter when the news was communicated to her, and said cheerfully that Dan would be apt to be writing to explain the way of it. But in truth her heart sank down and down, and she felt a miserable conviction that no letter was coming. Soon, too, she knew, though they say, "Shwisht, woman," and broke off when she came near. How the neighbours were often standing in knots and saying it had a bad appearance, his slipping off out of the country that fashion without a word to anybody. It looked like as if he had a notion of running away from the match. The sight of those shawled heads bobbing together over her fate chilled Stacey with despair at times, and at others stung her with a wrathful pang, under which she could almost have found it in her heart to break up their conclave violently, accusing them to their faces of telling lies and talking blathers and nonsense. But she always stopped short of any such strong measures, quailing before her consciousness that her life was being overcast by a great black cloud, in the coming on of which this gossip's gabble seemed merely a trivial fringe of shadow. And the one discourtesy she used was to shrink away from all occasions of discourse, either sitting mute in a retired recess of the dark cabin room, or roaming off into the bog, where the solitude and silence toned down the brightness of the clear careless skies and made it more endurable. In this way it came about that the blue-vaulted forenoon, which by rights should have seen her conversion into Mrs. Daniel O'Beirne, was spent by Stacey in solitary forlornness. Crouched among the sad green furzes, minding the old goat, was how she described her occupation to her neighbours, and that a few hours later found her standing up uncomforted on the ridge, turning mournful grey eyes listlessly towards the rose and daffodil sunset, before she crept home through the gloaming, lit by no brighter hope than the prospect of sleepily forgetting her troubles until tomorrow. Days such as this came to her in a sequence, for amid the mellow sunshine of the late summer weather, which was transmuting the grain fields to roughened gold, and staining the briar leaves with bronze and crimson, and bringing out the dim purplish bloom of all the wild dark berries, dewberries and fronds and sloes, and even finishing off the little grey lichen cups with red sealing-wax rims, Stacey's hopes were shrivelling up and withering away. She did not really try to blind herself, whatever means she would fain have confronted her world with. Each blank morning and each cheerless evening heard her paraphrase, "Even here I will put off my hope and keep it no longer for my flatterer." Most piteous of vows, not oftener made than broken. After a few weeks had passed, she used to pray to her saints that she might not know of anybody going down to the town, because she could not avoid the bitter moment of watching him return without letters or tidings. Yet Stacey, sad as her plight, should not monopolise our sympathy. Young Dan's unaccountable non-appearance flung a portentous shadow across his father's horizon. He was slower than the girl to take the alarm, his wider experience suggesting a larger variety of harmless contingencies. But when once fear got firm hold of him, it gripped him with a hardly less agonizing rigour. If anything misfortunate had took and happened, his big handsome son, the light of his eyes, had been put out. But if the truth were that the lad had played a villain's trick on them, had given the lie to his grand promise, and run off from them, leaving the girl to break her heart, why then old Dan was doubly bereft both of trust and hope. Moreover, his distress was complicated by a feeling of compunction and responsibility towards Stacey and her family, which made the sight of them painful to him, and still forbade him to keep out of their way. "'Twasn't the lad's own fault, that's certain," he said one November day, sitting on an old potato creel by Mrs. Doyne's fire. "If I know the differ between porther and potheen, he'd no more go for to do us a turn like that, except agin his will, than he'd reive the eyes out of his head. There's somethin' gone amiss wid him that we haven't heard tell of." "True for you, Dan," said Mrs. Doyne resignedly. "I put it on them old steamboats myself. There's nothin' more dangerous. Sure the on'y time I iver made free wid one of them, a matter of 20 year back, away down at Lough Corrib, I came as nigh losin' me life as you could think. Set me foot over the edge of the bit of plank they'd laid down for the people to step on board by, and in the black wather I'd ha' been, only poor Mick grabbed hould of me. And sure if Dan done such a thing, and he thravellin' the deep seas, let alone a lough, what chanst he'd have but goin' to the bottom? Or where's the use of the talk they keep of his sendin' word in letters, and he all the while lyin' drowned dead, the Lord have mercy on his soul? Och, then goodness guide you, Mrs. Doyne, woman, but do you think the lad's a born natural, that he's not got the wit to step the length of a bit of gangway without blunderin' overboard like an old blind horse? Troth, it's a quare thing if a young man can't take a taste of diversion for onst in a way, but everybody must settle to murther him behind his back. Some of them do say 'twas that Maggie Farrelly he'd his mind set on all the while, and he's took off out of this liefer than content himself wid any one else. It's no credit to him to serve us that way, and the dacent lad he seemed, and the hope he thought of Stacey. Bedad, he wouldn't have given her for his pick of the stars out of the sky, if you were to believe him. I'd never ha' supposed it of him, so I wouldn't. And it's great ould lies they were tellin'. Whoever told you that? Maggie Farrelly, bedad. Divil a hapworth she was to him, let alone he isn't the slaveen to be playin' fast and loose wid your dacent slip of a daughter. It's little they'd to do to be puttin' them bad stories on him when he's overtook wid goodness can tell what ill luck away from his own country. Musha, man alive, isn't that what I was sayin' a minute ago? Drowned he may ha' been for certain, but there's a plinty more manners of destruction in it, plinty. Sure, the strongest ever stepped might be took suddint, like a candle light in a puff of wind, the saints protect us all. There was Peter Malloy of Glenish, as fine a young man as you'd see at Mass one Sunday and waked the next. A beautiful corpse he made, and so would poor Dan, unless it was drowndin' after all, and no layin' out to be done on him. Bad manners to it, woman. What talk you have of wakin' and buryin' and Maggie Farrelly? Cock her up, but it's true enough there do be girls will get round a man wid their slootherin' till he'll scarce know for a while what he's at. For a while just. It's past my belief that aught 'ud hold him long away from all of us here. I'm waitin' wid a job of plough-mendin' I have until he's back. Och, well, it's yourself knows the world, Dan, and to be sure he might easy enough get into bad company in them parts, and he had nobody to advise him agin it, or prevent them making a fool of him, the young bosthoon, with nary a thirteen of sense in his head. Sense in it? Bejabbers, Dan's got twice the sense of many a man double his age, and more to the back of that. It's liker then somethin's dispirits after happening him, the creature. But deed, and if the end of it was to ha' been his comin' home married to another girl, as some of them supposin', it's as black a day for us, 'twould." Here Stacey, to whom this balancing of probabilities had been as soothing as alternate stabs of ice and flame, stole forth from her dusky corner and slipped out at the door. Her mother, however, just saw her vanish and said dismayed, "That was Stacey herself. Well now, I've a head and so's a pin. I might have remembered she was in afore you did. We'd a right a held our tongues." As Stacey emerged into the honey-coloured westering light and began to saunter about aimlessly in the narrow grassy foot-tracks which threaded the shag of furze and heather on the slope behind her dwelling, she was descried by a group of neighbours who, a little way off, were watching Brian Kilfoyle cut scraws from a green swarded bank for the repair of his roof. When she guessed their observation, she made a feint of looking for bogberries, which were, as every one knew, no longer in season, and moved slowly off out of sight. "There goes poor Stacey Doyne," said Mrs. Brian, "moonin' along like some desolate old crathur. It's a pity to see her." "I just wish I had the regulatin' of that young Rip Dan O'Beirne," said Mrs. Quigley. "I'd give him a goin' over he wouldn't be apt to forget in one while." "Sure how can we tell he's to blame?" said Mrs. Brian. "Somethin's maybe gone agin him. But Anyway, poor Stacey might as well put the thought of him out of her mind as soon as she can contrive it. There's scarce a likeliness of his iver showin' his face again in Lisconnel. We'll see that some wisp of cloud that's after sailin' in behind the sun there comes sailin' back to us first, if you ask my opinion. Och, Stacey Doyne, she wouldn't be overlong troubled frettin' after him if she had but the chance of ever any one handy," said Sally Sheridan, her words tumbling out thickly in a sudden spiteful flurry, as if they had been pent up unspoken for an irksome length of time. "She'll never want for a sweetheart if it depends on herself, though maybe she doesn't find them so easy to pick up. I'm thinkin' 'twas herself done most of the courtin' for young O'Beirne. He was in no great hurry over the matter. At all events he was in a greater one to be shut of her." "Just look here, me good girl," said the widow M'Gurk, "you've no call to be sayin' any such a thing now. None whatsomever, even supposin' it was the truth you were tellin' instead of a black lie. Little Stacey Doyne's not the sort to be courtin' herself sweethearts, and she's no need sorrow a bit, has she? For whativer may have come to him since, 'twas plain to be seen young Dan thought the world hadn't her match, or anything fine enough for her in it." "And let me tell you, Sally Sheridan," said Mrs. Rafferty, "that when a girl passes them kind of remarks, other people do be very apt to think she's judgin' accordin' to her own carryins on, and it gives her an uncommon unplisant appearance." Miss Sally was in reality considerably disconcerted by the rebuke of her elders, who stood eyeing her severely from beneath their fluttering shawls, and who obviously had the sense of the company with them. However, she would not let on that she minded, and strolled away, snatching at the bushes as she passed, and humming a surly tune in a manner meant to indicate unconcern. "But it's a pity, so it is, about Stacey," resumed Mrs. Brian. "You can see to be the look of her that she's just frettin' herself to flitterjigs. And her poor mother was tellin' me yisterday that she'll scarce open her lips from mornin' till night, but sits mopin' in the corner, or streels off by herself on the bog. The poor woman's fairly distracted wid uneasiness, and I don't wonder at it. They do say 'twas a disappointment of that sort gave Mad Bell's wits a turn. And if Stacey was to go like her, demented poor old body, bedad 'twould be a sorrowful sight, and fit to break the hearts of them that reared her. Sakes and patience, Jim. Keep from under our feet, there's a good child. I was near waddlin' over you that time like an old duck." "Talking of Mad Bell," said Mrs. Rafferty, "she's away wid herself again. Set off this mornin' afore it was light, so Big Anne tould me. Says she to Anne, 'I'm afeard,' says she, 'of them deep snowdrifts out there on the bog. Goodness can tell what put snow in the crathur's head. Starvin' and perishin', says she. 'Twill be wid yous here this winter, and I'm away to the people where the ships is, Galway belike,' so off she went." "Well now, that's a bad hearin', mark my words," said Mrs. Quigley, looking scared. "Mad Bell and folks like her do have surprisin' notions about things wherever they get them. But there's no great signs that I can see of a hard winter comin' on us, would you say there was, Brian?" "I dunno," said Brian, trimming the edges of a symmetrical smooth green sod. "I perceived a couple of seagulls flyin' inland this mornin', straight and steady. Bad cess to them." "But Brian," pursued Mrs. Quigley, dropping her voice, "have you heard any talk lately about thim ones? For since young Mick Ryan—" "Och, blathers," said Brian. Whisht then," said Mrs. Brian, turning away hastily, "the child's a listenin'. Anyhow, I must be steppin' home." "And I," said Mrs. Quigley, "weary on it," she observed dejectedly as she went down the road. Maybe Stacey's as well out of settin' up wid housekeepin' these times, if she knew but all. Starvin's bad enough for yourself, but when it comes to the childer, och, wirra, that's starvin' wid heartbreakin' tacked on to the end of it." Stacey, however, was as yet in no mood to take a philosophical view of the situation. She still carried her trouble in both hands, as we do with such things while they are new to us. Afterwards we generally stow them away in a pack which we keep on our shoulders, where they make their weight felt, it is true, but do not hinder us from going more or less heavily about our wonted avocations. And in mere course of time Stacey might so have disposed of hers, even if nothing had occurred to accelerate matters. A day or two afterwards she fell in with a crony of hers on one of her dismal bog trottings. Jim Kilfoyle was a man who for some 4 years had been contemplating his world through a pair of very large and observant Irish blue eyes, and drawing his own conclusions therefrom with an independence of thought which often gave the charm of originality to his theories. On the present occasion they had guided him to a spray of belated blackberries, which the vague November sunbeams had scarcely tinged even with the crudest red, but which he had no scruples about plucking in their rathest immaturity. "Them berries are too green to be atin', Jimmy," Stacey remonstrated mildly, but he curtly replied, "Here's 2 buns for yourself, and let me have a bit of food in peace." So she prudently gave up the point. When he had swallowed with inexplicable satisfaction the last hard knob of sour seeds, he sat staring at Stacey for some time, and then said meditatively, "I don't think you look anyways so like Mad Bell, Stacey." "Mercy be among us, Jim, like Mad Bell?" Stacey said with a little laugh. At 18 a pretty girl's vanity is perhaps the last peak to be submerged, and the first to reappear in any swelling tide of affliction, and a comparison between herself and a wizened little old cracked woman could not but strike her as grotesquely incongruous. Sure, what at all should ail me to be looking like Mad Bell, poor old crathur?" "Me mother says so then," said Jim rather sternly, for he suspected a disabling of his judgment in Stacey's laugh. "She and Mrs. Quigley yisterday, when you were above on the hill, streelin' about like Mad Bell, they said you were, and fit to break iverybody's heart." "Did they say anything else, Jim?" said Stacey, with a catch in her voice, as if an icy gust had blown in her face and taken away her breath. "Dunno," said Jim, and either could not or would not supply any further information. But what he had stated made her feel hot and cold. Hitherto, so far as her dreary preoccupation allowed her to consider external affairs, she had believed that she was keeping her miseries strictly to herself, and betraying to nobody how her world had been turned into a wilderness. And now she abruptly learned that her conduct had led her neighbours to suppose her going daft, an intolerable revelation, against which all her pride rose up in arms. It found an auxiliary in the feeling of self-reproach roused by Jim's reference to the breaking of everybody's heart, for she knew very well that everybody in this connection could only mean her mother, towards whom she was conscious of having displayed during the past weeks a frank morosity and undisguised gloom. As cross as any old weasel, and as contrary as anything you could give a name to, she called herself in her awakening remorse. Under such circumstances, this demeanour, rightly interpreted, is often really tantamount to a friendly vote of confidence. Yet it blackens in the retrospect when the memory, sensitised by the touch of conscience, is exposed to a new point of view. As Stacey sat silently beside the silent Jim, who had fallen to grubbing droves of scampering ants out of crevices in the bank with a little bit of twig. Her thoughts turned upon troubles of which she was not the isolated victim, and when she presently got up and moved away, she said to herself, "I'll slip home and be digging the pitaties for dinner." The resolution sounded scarcely heroic, yet it nevertheless marks the place where Stacey, so to speak, faced about. A retreat in some disorder had been converted into a rally. As if in confirmation of the saying that fortune favours the brave, Stacey soon happened upon a small scrap of comfort, which, flimsy as was its material, sometimes stood her in good stead. On that same afternoon, her half-instinctive groping about among her scanty resources for some object of distraction ended in a determination to step out and ask Peg Sheridan for the loan of a skein of yarn, with which she might set herself up a piece of knitting. "Peg's been uncommon good-natured," she reflected. "She'll let me have it in a minute if she's got e'er a thread." But on her way to the Sheridans, Stacey was overtaken by old Ody Rafferty, who quitted his digging to shout that he hadn't seen her for a month of Sundays, and came shuffling down the potato drill with uneludible nimbleness to intercept her at the dyke. She could not, without marked incivility, avoid stopping to speak, and when they had duly said, "How's yourself this long while?" and finally, "Glory be to goodness," Ody prevented her from passing on by catching a corner of her shawl. "Stacey, me child, listen now to me," he said. "I was wantin' to tell you you've no call to be discouraged anyways about young Dan not comin' home." Stacey listened submissively. She was by this time acquainted with most of her neighbours' several theories on her sweetheart's defection, and they were not on the whole consolatory. "I'll tell you the way of it, Stacey," he said. "He's just took and enlisted. That's what he's after doin', and don't believe anyone that says anything different. Sure I've a right to know what I'm talkin' about, considerin' I've been well acquainted with the lad from the time he was 3 feet high, that stands 6'2" this day in his stocking feet. It's many the mile we've tramped together, himself and meself and misfort'nate poor Jinny, and I know as well as I know me own name that he'd a great notion of soldierin'. Troth, I could ha' told you that much iver since one day I saw him standin' lookin' after a military band that went by us down at Kilmacrone. And be the powers of smoke, he'll have a grand dragoon, Dan will. Proud any regiment might be to get a hould of him. 'Twould do one's heart good to see him in his uniform, and so we will one of these fine days, for you may depind he's just schemin' to give us a queer old surprise wid marchin' in on us in all his illigance. And that's the reason why he's niver said a word, just to take us unbeknownst. Not but what it might be a while first. I shouldn't wonder if Dan was apt to wait till he's got a bit of promotion. The idea I have in me own mind is that he'll likely put it off till he's riz to be a colour sergeant. I fancy that Ody's own mind supposed this officer to derive his title from the peculiar gorgeousness of his accoutrements, and then he'll come back a sight to behold, he that went off wid the daylight shinin' through the old coat that was on him like a blinkin' behind a gaped dyke. Och, Stacey, it's a proud girl you'll be that day, jewel. That set up, you'll scarce have a word for one of the rest of us." "I'm sure I never thought to mind him bein' raggedy like," said Stacey piteously. "And how'd he come home, sergeant or no, if they're maybe sendin' him off to be kilt in the wars?" "Is it kilt? Divil a much. Why, for one thing, I don't believe there's ever a war in it now, good or bad. I was spellin' over an old Cork Examiner a couple of days ago, and sorra a sign of war could I see in it at all, no more than if the world had took to wool windin'. And another thing is, accordin' to what I'm informed, the troops these times don't ever get fightin' rightly at all, but just sling about easy miles off each other, and let fly an odd cannon ball or so now and again to pacify whoever it was sent them out. So it's a comical thing if an infant child, let alone a grown man, couldn't stand clear of that much without puttin' himself greatly about. I tell you, you needn't be vexin' your mind, Stacey, for as sure as me soul's in me body, it's enlisted Dan is, and steppin' home to Lisconnel he'll be afore we're any of us much older. He's the lad that 'ud never go for to disremember the ould people and the ould place, let alone his bit of a colleen du. Not if he was to become head commander in general by land and say. End of section 6.